Alright students, welcome back for another video on kind of these advanced class concepts that involve overloading and static, and this topic that we're going to talk about this time, which is private versus public. Alright, so you'll see here, and this concept is a little hard to explain, so bear with me and I'll try to do my best. But without having done a lot of computer science, the reason for this may be hard to see, the high level. I think the low level I can do a pretty clear explanation on, but the high level reasoning here is a little tricky. So here's the thing. So our system that we've created now for adding students and updating student IDs is that we start at 1,000, and every new student gets a new number added to their ID. Well, there could be potential privacy concerns here. You know, if you know when a person joined and you know the ID number of the person who joined after them and the person who joined before them, then you would know their ID number, and so you could potentially do some abusive things if you knew ID numbers. Like if there are forms that require student ID numbers for verification or whatever, having a sequential system like this may be a problem. And so maybe, you know, there are systems that use random number generators to add various numbers. There's plenty of other more complicated and also better ways of tracking ID numbers. For our purposes, let's say that we wanted to, and again, this wouldn't really solve the problem if you knew the system, but it'll serve for our example for now. Let's say that we wanted to add 3 every time instead of 1, just to make it a little harder to track maybe. And maybe people who don't know our system and couldn't figure it out would have trouble. Realistically, this would be a little better using random, right? We could import java.util.random and go into that. I'd be happy to talk about random if you want to, but for now that's not the purpose of this video, so I don't want to spend time importing it and talking about it and talking about what it does. So we're just going to switch and show that we decided we wanted to switch our thing. Now, I remembered to change the next ID and how I update it in 2 different places. Right, so now there are 2 places where we need to change next ID, and so if we go back into our class and say, well, really we shouldn't just add 3, we really should do it randomly or something to that effect, then we would also have to remember, let's change it here, and let's change it down here, and if we ever forgot, well, now we have this weird inconsistent system and we could end up with a lot of problems. And so instead of that, it may be helpful to have a private helper method, and so we're going to create a method that we're just going to call anytime we need to update our ID. So I'm going to call this, let's see, we're going to make it private, and I'll talk about what private versus public does in a second here. But I'm going to make this private, and I'm going to say it's void, it returns nothing. Our whole purpose is just to update our next ID counter here. So we're going to call it private void update ID, and it will take no inputs, and basically its goal is to replace kind of these 2 lines of code, ID equals next ID plus equals 3. So to start with, we're going to say anytime we want to update someone's ID or maybe set someone's ID, we would do ID equals next ID, and then something like next ID, and we'll stick with our plus equals 3 system here, plus equals 3. Now, there is a warning, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. Actually, maybe now is the time. The warning is that this method, update ID, from the type student is never used locally. Now, locally means within the student class. So why would we have a warning about that? We didn't get a warning about that with, for example, getID. We never call a getID in this class, and yet we don't have a warning about it. So why do we have a warning about this? And the answer is that this method is private. That private versus public is what's causing this particular warning message here. And the reason is public and private kind of work differently, or allow you to access things differently. So before I clean up the rest of my code here, I'm going to talk about private and public. So private means that this method, update ID, is only usable and accessible within the student class itself. As in, I can replace this code with update ID, open and close parentheses, right? So I can update this code to call my update ID method, since I'm in the class, I don't have to create an object to call the method. I can just use the method's name directly, and that tells us to call the method. So within a class, you can just call a method like this. And then, and I can do it down here too, so maybe fixing the code does make sense. So we can update ID in both places. And the value here is that now, if I decide, okay, instead of plus equals 3, I should do a random number, or maybe I should do plus equals 5 or plus equals 7 or something, and I want to change how IDs are updated, well, I can change it in one place, and it fixes it in all the places where update ID is used. So now we have one little helper method whose job is to correctly update our next ID variable based on whatever rules we decided we want to use to update IDs. And the private part means that I can call the method in this class, like I've demonstrated here in line 39 and line 19. But what I cannot do is call the method in my tester class. So for example, I cannot do student1.update ID. Update ID is set with private. That means I cannot access update ID. In fact, if I mouse over it in Eclipse, it says the method update ID from the student type is not visible. The not visible thing is related to private versus public. So update ID does exist, but it is private, which means other classes cannot use it or see it, which is why the visibility thing is there. So I cannot call this method. And so there are times when you only want a method to be used inside our class, and I don't want people to be able to just update our next ID themselves. I just want to only do it in this class to make sure that it's only updated when a student ID is updated, or when a new student is created. That's the only time this updates, because update ID is private and I can therefore control its usage in my class and make sure it's not fiddled with or used outside of my class. And so that's what private is for. And as a side note, as the rule of thumb so far, we've used private for fields and public for methods, because mostly we're writing these methods to be used. And fields you almost never want to make public, because then people can change last names and first names and however they want. If I made ID public, then people could just set, the person who uses my class could just set student IDs to whatever they wanted to by saying something like this. Let me show you. Let's make this public. Do a real trial. Wow, if I can type. All right, public and ID. So now what this means is I can do student1.id equals, I don't know, 7, 1, 2, 3, I don't know, whatever I want to. And I've now directly changed the ID number of my student without going through my system of updating IDs. And so now as the creator of this class, I have no control whatsoever over what the ID number is. Or if I made this public, I'd have no control over what next ID is, and people could mess up next ID. And so making sure that users can't misuse your code is what private and public are for. So I can make this class, other people can import it and use it, but when they do, they can no longer change ID, right? I changed ID back to private. Now I get an error saying the field student.id is not visible. Therefore, whoever uses my class can't directly change my ID number or student ID numbers. So that's what public and private do. They control what other classes can see and do. Within my class, I can always use private or public methods, but outside my class, when I send it out to other people to code and work with, they can only use public classes. And so sometimes you might want to make like a private method to help you, do things like this, like make sure that we always update IDs the same way. So we have a helper method to make sure we always update IDs the same way. And if we ever need to go back and edit our class, we have to change one spot to fix it everywhere. But other people who use my class, now have to use whatever rules I create for updating IDs. So it's all about controlling and organizing our information here. So hopefully that makes sense, and I will see you guys next time.